But you're definitely aware of the magic that you were in front of.
Oh, I was thrilled beyond belief that I had the father of bluegrass on my radio show, and I could ask him what I wanted. And I've always had good questions to ask these people, not the, well, how did you start playing music? Although sometimes that's a great question. But anyway, so he was 55, which to me seemed like older than
and that's the era. Don't trust anybody over 30 at that time.
Right. At that time, well, he's Bill Monroe. I'll trust him a little bit. So I asked him the usual questions, and then I just couldn't help myself, and I said, Bill, how much longer do you think you could still be playing bluegrass? Because I thought when you're 55, you should. It's amazing you can stand up.
Yeah.
And Monroe's a tough customer, but he says, well, I think about 10 or 15 years, he said. So when it was 20 years later and I ran into him, I told him about how he told me 10 or 15 years, and now it's 20 and he's still going strong. I said, what about that? He said, well, I thought my voice wouldn't hold out, but it stays up there, don't it? I said, it sure does. And
he was such a character. I mean, I never met him personally, but all the stories I've been told, he was such a one in a million for good or ill, you know what I mean?
What I would say at the time, I said, anytime he goes any place and does anything, he leaves in his wake a whole bunch of Bill Monroe stories.
Yeah.
And one of his sidemen, for instance, Butch Robbins, was in his band for 4 years, and I talked a lot to Butch, and he said, if Monroe didn't like the way the sun came up that morning, he could explain to you how the sun should have come up this morning. And just everything he did, people would talk about because he was such an odd character. And I had a whole bunch of Ronnie McCurry, when he heard the interviews I did with Monroe, said, I can't believe him, you asked him those kind of questions, and he answered them. But I had the nerve to do it, and he, when I had him at the right time, he would really go on about things, and it was cool. One of the weird things about Monroe is that he hated acknowledging anybody else's contribution to bluegrass music unless it was in the form of as one of his employees.
Yeah.
So he always considered Earl Scruggs an ex-employee rather than a giant of music who brought more people into bluegrass than anybody. And he refused to call the banjo style that everybody calls Scruggs style. He wouldn't call it Scruggs style. He called it Snuffy Jenkins style because Snuffy Jenkins was an older guy who played a crude version of what we now call Scruggs style. And Monroe considered them practically equivalent, which is nothing against Snuffy Jenkins.
It's like a backhanded comment.
Well, it's not even a compliment or anything. It's just he was giving all the credit to Snuffy Jenkins, as though Earl wouldn't know how to play except for Snuffy Jenkins, which is completely not true. And he even said, then he told me, there's no telling how much good Molly and Tenbrook's done for Earl Scruggs, meaning I provided him a song that he could shine on.
Yeah.
And then he became a star thanks to me. And he was into trashing Earl in a sort of backhanded way.
I mean, he would
not
bash
trashing him, but
then like later on in life, he kind of like he would
eventually mellow. He'd eventually mellow.
Yeah.
But Earl didn't even like being around Monroe in a public situation. He said I knew Earl pretty well, and he said I have the biggest respect for him. The best band I was ever in was his band, including Flatt and Scruggs. He felt the best band was the Bill Monroe band where he met Lester Flatt. But he said, I don't like being around him in a public situation because Monroe will somehow put me in my place, meaning, well, I gave Earl Scruggs his start and he'd be nowhere without me. And Monroe explained to me that if he hadn't given Earl a job, he would have gone back and worked on a treadmill his whole life, which could have been true, but Earl changed everything. And it was interesting that he would avoid being with him in public because he'd end up getting victimized. Monroe didn't mind expounding on things like this, and Earl was not a public speaker. So but Earl was younger and outlived Monroe, so when he revised his instruction book and he expanded the autobiography, at the end of the book tripled its size because it had originally come out in '68 and he revised it in 2005. So he had a lot of tales to tell. And he was able to trash Monroe back when Monroe was already in his grave. And so it's now a matter of record, some of the stuff he said about Monroe.
Well, so you've been, 50 years in the industry? I
Well,
guess.
more if you want to go back to 1963 when I first started a radio program, and I was playing by that time.
54 years.
Yeah, if you want to.
What does that number mean to you as a performer and someone who loves this music?
Well, it means that I was around for stuff. I remember when at that first Bluegrass festival, and I was 19, and Mac Wiseman and Bill Monroe recapped the music they had made. What at the time was like 17 years before. And I thought, how terrible this is. I wasn't around for that. But I did get to hear them sing again together. And now I realize that if somebody's 40, they didn't see a ton of stuff.
I mean, I'm a bluegrass freak who's a journalist, and I don't know what I would do to interview those people.
I saw Flatt and Scruggs in their prime. I was there at the Carnegie Hall concert that became a record. I was 16 and I went. And that was the third time I saw them. So I saw them at their peak, although I would have rather seen them earlier as well, like in their first few years as a band. I think that's when they hit the pinnacle right within 2 years, and they were all living in trailers. They were poor guys, but that's when they recorded Foggy Mountain Breakdown that made Earl a millionaire. Eventually, it took a while for him to become a millionaire, but he finally became one. He lived in a mansion, in the last years of his life. But I was around for that. I heard Jimmy Martin with a phenomenal band with Bill Emerson in it.
Did you get to play with any of those guys at all?
A little bit. One time Jimmy double booked himself in Connecticut and New Jersey. So I went to see him in New Jersey, no idea that he wasn't going to be there. And my friend, Dave Bromberg was a contemporary of mine. We went to college together. So we went to see Jimmy, and we're sitting at the club, and they say, he'll be here. And so finally he comes in about 11:30 at night. We're still there, and he has no band with him. So they say, who can play with Jimmy? And I said, I will.
Oh my God.
So
that's unbelievable.
Dave Bromberg and I got up there, and we were Jimmy Martin's band for a few songs. And the first thing he does is look at me and he says, kick off Freeborn Man. And that was his new single, and I hadn't heard it yet. I got all his singles because I was a DJ, but I didn't know what Freeborn Man sounded like. So the first thing he gives me to do, I don't know how to do. And I think, all right, strike one.
I heard that he had the ear. I heard that he had an ear where he could listen to 6 people at once and know exactly what everyone was doing wrong.
Well, I never heard that, but it sounds consistent with what I do know, which is
he was a stickler.
Total stickler. He was the guy who would tell somebody, that ain't right. And Monroe was like that. That ain't right. There's no politeness involved.
Oh, yeah.
Right now, it's so
business.
Yeah, they had to survive. These guys grew up on farms. They were trying to avoid factory jobs, and
we're going back to the farm.
Or going back to the farm that was going to fail. I mean, Ralph had to sell all his cattle to pay his band one year. Sold all his cattle. Because he had to pay the band, and he was committed to his career. And it was very tough times. So they were scrapping. They were very competitive with each other. They were enemies of each other. You couldn't put them on the same bill because they were enemies. They had played together, but they had no use for each other anymore. They were competitors. And I could see all that, and it was just an amazing world. I'm from the Bronx. I went to Columbia. What am I doing with all these people? Well, I'm in love with their music deeply, and I love talking to them because they have a wisdom that I'm not used to. My professors don't have the kind of wisdom that Ralph Stanley had, and I preferred Ralph's wisdom. In many cases, it was more applicable to what I felt was important in life, because they were dealing with real people. My professors were just dealing with college students and trying to get tenure, and they were in an ivory tower, isolated from the society. And
they didn't have that rock star mentality, where they were like you couldn't reach them, you couldn't talk to them.
Well, the professors were just professors, and they would be happy to mentor me about how to get a university job. And I soon realized that the university environment was not my thing, and I quit my job thanks to writing an instruction book. I wrote the second instruction book about how to play Earl Scruggs style banjo. Earl wrote the first one, and it only had mainly transcriptions. And I had a method. I had been teaching banjo while I was in college, and I figured out how to teach Scruggs style. And when I got that book published, it sold a ton of copies. And I was making enough money to quit my job, so I did.
You might kick us out right now.
Sorry about that. I didn't know you were
Oh, wait, so I guess my last question is, what is a life playing music and performing and traveling the world taught you about what it means to be a human being?
What a great question. Let me collect a thought or two on that. What it means to be a human being. All right, well, what it means to be a human being to me, and
all your experiences.
Well, my religion is sort of a self-created religion that has no God in it, but it has a lot of golden rule in it. And it also tries to take into account all of humans' fallibilities as well as their great points. And I have certainly seen that in Bluegrass. You know, I've seen amazingly generous and thoughtful and dignified and right-on behavior from all these famous Bluegrass stars. And I've also seen them act like silly, spoiled teenagers. I've seen it all, and I've seen silly, spoiled teenagers also rise way above. You know, I've known a lot of people way before they got famous, and then like Jerry Garcia, in 1963, I happened to be in Palo Alto for the summer, and we became buds, and we were in a little band together. He switched to mandolin.
Were you in Mother McCree's?
No, I was never. We had a band called the God-Awful Palo Alto Bluegrass Ensemble.
With Garcia
and David Nelson. It was just for a few months because I was there for the summer, and they needed it. Robert Hunter had just left their band, the Black Mountain Boys, and they had no band. So now they had a band with me in it. We just played a few gigs. It wasn't any big deal, but I knew Jerry before anybody. And when I later stayed friends with him, he said, "You're one of the people I trust because I knew you before I was famous.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I trust people who only know me since I'm famous." So a lot of people I've been in that with. And I've also seen, you know, I was there for Doc Watson's next to last performance of his life. I saw one of Earl's last performances. I saw one of Les Paul's last performances. I, was around Ralph Stanley a lot before he died. So I get to see the full life cycle because I first saw Ralph when he was in his 30s, you know. So that's what age will do for you. If you stay interested in the same stuff, you get to see a bunch of evolution happen before your eyes, and people turn into old people and bring their sons on stage with them in many cases, like Earl and Ralph and Bill all did, and Doc. They all brought their sons with them on stage. And then you get to see how the son deals with being in the shadow of his famous father. So there's a lot of really fascinating stuff. And what you learn about being a human being is everything that you can about being a human being. And then you also, half of the human population is female. So then you don't get to learn that much about females in Bluegrass until Laurie Lewis and Alison Krauss and Lynn Morris show up. And I knew all them too, going through being overlooked because they were females, right up to winning Female Vocalist of the Year, which is a long trip. And I knew them all the way along. So these are deep treasured memories as well as the friendships that are involved. And it's a treasure to me is all I can say, and I'm so glad I realized I should get out of academia and study the world firsthand. I've been in like 20 countries performing, and I've been in all the United States except North Dakota, and I've never performed in Alabama. But I've been in all the other states. And I teach a lot. So I've taught people from all those states, and I've given a jam camp in Prague with people from 7 European countries. So that's a good way to learn.
Agreed.
And I just try to learn and fit in and
be a lifelong sponge.
A sponge, but also a leader. I was IBMA president for 15 years, and I took that really seriously. So I gave some direction to some things, and I helped bring a lot of kids into Bluegrass, which is one of my proudest.